Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. Now, depending on where you are in the world, it could be getting close to time to start seeds, which is one of my favorite times of the year. So, in order to be successful gardening, it's kind of important to know some seeds you just stick directly in the ground. That's called direct sowing. Some of them really do better if you start them inside in your house first, and it's really important to know which is which. So that's really what we're going to be talking about in today's video. So when you're thinking about starting seeds or even planting a garden in general, one of the most important things to know is when your last frost date is. This is going to be the last date in the spring where you would normally expect a frost in your area. Now, you can do a search online and you can find out the estimated last frost date for your area. That is, of course, only going to be an estimate. It's not going to be 100% accurate. So don't look that up and then say, okay, my last frost date is May 15th, so on May 16th, I'm going to go ahead and plant out my whole garden. You want to look up what your estimated last frost date is so that you have an idea and you have a time for when to plant. You want to make sure that you have your warm weather plants ready to go out in the garden around that time. But when that time comes, you still want to keep an eye on your forecast. Now, if my estimated last frost date comes and goes, I check my 10-day forecast and I have no lows that are at freezing or close to freezing, then I say, okay, I should be good. I can go ahead and plant my plants out. But if I have a day or two where it's forecast to get at freezing, below freezing, or even within a few degrees of freezing, I'm not going to plant my plants out yet. You've invested so much time and work into getting those plants ready. So when that last frost date comes, or the estimated last frost date comes, don't immediately run out there. But for the purposes of this video, you do want to know when your estimated last frost date is so that you can plan when to plant your plants. Now, the first category of plants, or the first category of seeds we're going to talk about are what's called direct sow. As I mentioned, what that means is that when you are planting these types of seeds, you can just pick their final place where they're going to go out in the garden. You can just stick those seeds right out there in the garden. It's super easy. But you want to make sure that you're doing that with the right plants. You also want to make sure that you're doing it at the right time. So what I would do right now is, if you don't know your estimated last frost date for your area, I would go ahead and pause this video, do an internet search and find out the estimated last frost date for your town or the nearest town close to you, and then go ahead and write that date down and keep it in mind through the rest of this video. So back to direct sown vegetables. So there are some types of vegetables that really just do best when they're direct sown. You can see I've got my seed collection here with me, and in this seed collection, I've got a mix of seeds that I'm going to be starting early in my house and some that I'm just going to wait for the right time and then I'm going to plant them directly out into the garden. So direct sow vegetables are some of the easiest vegetables you can grow. Even though there are many plants that do best direct sown, you might still, if you're out at the local nursery or the local box store, you might still find transplants available for these plants. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a great idea to buy those. Some plants really just do. Some plants can do well direct sown or transplanted. Some really prefer to be direct sown. So even if you find transplants for many of these plants, it is almost always cheaper to buy a seed pack than to buy a single transplant. And that seed pack has the potential to become many, many plants as opposed to one plant from that transplant. Or even if you find a six pack, 6 plants, most seed packets will have 20 or more seeds, which has the potential to become a lot more food for you. So some vegetables that are really good candidates for being direct sown include root crops. Most root crops actually do significantly better when they're direct sown. That's because you're growing them for the root. You want the root to be well formed, and these plants really don't like to have their roots disturbed. For example, carrots. So while you may be able to find carrot transplants for sale locally, I wouldn't necessarily recommend buying those. Carrots tend to do best if you plant their seeds where they're going to grow, where they're going to live their entire lives. If you transplant carrot seedlings, what can happen is often the roots can get bent and deformed, and then when you go to harvest them, you can get some pretty weird looking carrots. While that might be kind of fun and interesting to see, it's not really the most practical when it comes to food. So with the exception of onions really do best when they're started early, but for the most part, root vegetables really do prefer to be sown directly in the ground where they're going to spend the duration of their lives. Another example of a plant that really does well when it's direct sown is peas. Now, you may find pea transplants for sale. You may even start them in your house. Honestly, I think that pea transplants will probably do okay, but they're just so much easier to direct sow and so much cheaper. I have seen at my local grocery store, I've seen 6-packs of pea seedlings for sale for probably $2.99, I can't remember the exact price, where I can buy an entire packet of pea seeds for that price, and I can plant 50 to 100 peas with about the same amount of effort. Peas are so easy. I just plant them where they're right next to something that they can climb. I plant mine right along the edge of my garden fence. I just poke the seeds into the ground and let them grow. So much easier, and you get so much more for the same amount of money. Another plant that does really well direct sown is beans. Kind of similarly to peas, you can just poke those in the ground. If it's a pole variety, a climbing variety, you do want to give it something to climb. If it's a bush variety, you just want to give it a little bit of space. You just wait until it's warm enough, till your soil's warmed up enough. You can just plant those bean seeds right in the ground, and it's so much less effort than starting transplants or even than transplanting purchased transplants. So another category of plants that I find really does better and saves you a lot of effort by direct sowing is lettuce and salad greens. Now, you can start some lettuce early. I have done that before. Sometimes when I want to get a little bit of a head start, I'll just plant a couple little 6-packs with some lettuce seeds, and then I'll transplant those out. I can get a couple weeks head start that way. But honestly, what I've usually found is that when I transplant those out, I also start additional lettuce seeds out in the garden at the same time. I find that while the transplanted lettuce gets a little bit of a head start and may look more healthy for a little while, I find that usually my direct sown lettuce catches up and even surpasses the lettuce that I've transplanted. So the last couple years, I haven't even started lettuce inside in my house. I've just direct sown it all. I find that it does better, it's easier for me, and it saves me a lot of time. And if I was going to be purchasing started transplants, it would also save me quite a bit of money. Now, there have been times when I've seen those beautiful lettuce transplants for sale, and I have purchased some, and they do give me a little bit of a head start. So I'm not saying never do that, but I find that lettuce really, and other salad greens as well, they really do prefer to be direct sown for the most part. Another plant that I find really does better direct sown, at least in my experience, is squash, particularly summer squash. I grow zucchini every year. For a while, I was starting my zucchini plants inside. I would start them a few weeks before my last frost date, plant them out after my last frost date, and they would do reasonably well for me. But what I started trying to do was to stagger my harvest. So I started a couple zucchini plants inside, and then when I transplanted those zucchini plants outside, I would start more seeds directly in the ground, and basically the same thing happened with the lettuce. I found that the zucchini that was direct sown caught up and surpassed and was ultimately more successful than the transplanted zucchini. Now, that's not to say you can't start zucchini from transplants. If there's some reason why maybe there's pests that are eating your plants when you first start them out, you find that they do better when you transplant them out a couple weeks old, then definitely go ahead and start your zucchini inside. But it has been my experience that summer squash really does do better when it's direct sown. Now, kind of similarly, I've had similar experiences with cucumbers for the most part. This is probably going to be area dependent, but last year I actually did start all my cucumbers early inside. The reason for that was I had some garden pest that was coming along and nipping the tops off all of my cucumber plants for the last 2 years. They do that as soon as the plants germinate, and then they never get a chance to grow. Because of that, what I ended up doing was switching and starting all my cucumber plants early inside. Once the plants were a few weeks old, a little bit larger, whatever pest that was didn't bother the plants. So I was able to transplant them out there and have a good harvest. Now, I never did find out what pest it was, so I can't tell you what to look out for. But if you don't have that pest in your area, then I do find that cucumbers do really well direct sown. What I will probably do this year is direct sow some cucumbers and also start some inside as a backup. That way, if my direct sown cucumbers are getting eaten, then I'll have my started cucumbers inside as a backup. So some of these things, I'm telling you plants that do well direct sown, but there could be extenuating circumstances where for one reason or another, it really is better for you to start that plant inside. This isn't like a hard and fast rule. This is just some generalization and some things to be aware of. Now, the other category of plants are plants that do better when you start them early inside. This can include plants that have a really long growing season. For example, tomatoes, peppers, eggplants. Plants like that have a long growing season. And so what may happen, especially if you have a short growing season, if you direct sow those kinds of plants, you may not have a long enough season to be able to harvest them before your first frost comes and kills the plants. It may also be the situation where even if you do have a long enough growing season, you might be robbing yourself of several weeks of harvest by not starting your plants early inside. By starting those plants early, then what happens is you're giving yourself a jump on the growing season. You're giving your plants a little bit of a head start. Once you put them out in the garden, they'll be a little bit larger, a little bit stronger, a little bit more able to handle the elements. Now, if you have an extremely long growing season, you may be able to direct sow tomatoes and cucumbers. If you do, I would love to hear from you in the comments about how that works for you, because everyone that I know does start their plants early inside. But again, I am growing here in Connecticut. I know many of you are probably farther south than me, have much warmer growing seasons or much longer growing seasons than me. So if that's you, I would love to hear from you about that. Now, there are some plants that have specific growing requirements that make them easier or more successful when they're started inside. For example, members of the brassica family like broccoli, cauliflower, kale, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, those have a short enough growing season, and they're also, to some extent, cold tolerant or frost tolerant, that the reason that I start those inside doesn't really have to do with temperature, or doesn't really have to do with the length of my growing season. It has to do with, first of all, I find that those plants are fairly susceptible to pests when they're really small. So if I direct sow those out in my garden, what happens a lot of times is the plants get damaged or eaten before they're really large enough to withstand any kind of pest damage. So for that reason, I find they do better when started inside. Another thing is that those are all cool weather plants, which means that they prefer the cool weather of spring and fall. They're not as much a fan of the really hot summer weather. So they really do best if you're able to harvest them before it gets really hot. While my growing season is long enough that I could, in theory, direct sow broccoli in my garden, as soon as it's warm enough for the broccoli, my season would be long enough to get a harvest, in theory. But what would happen is before the broccoli was able to be harvested, it would be hotter than it would really like. It would be likely to not be as successful. And that's probably even more of a consideration if you're somewhere in the south where you have really hot summers. I know some places, some areas, it's more successful when you grow broccoli over the winter months. Here in Connecticut, it gets a little bit too cold for that, but I do like to give it a little bit of a head start. So I've already mentioned a few varieties of plants that really do better started early, but I'm just going to go through the list here. I'm going to mention tomatoes. Tomatoes really do better when started early for the reasons that we already mentioned. They require a long growing season. It's better to just put an established plant in the ground. Similarly with peppers, eggplants, those plants are all in the same family. They have similar growing requirements. And in my area, my last frost date isn't until the middle of May. If I waited till then to stick a tomato seed in the ground, I would most likely not be getting tomatoes until right before my first frost, which would mean that I either would have a very limited harvest or potentially not a harvest at all. I also like to give those plants a chance to get a little bit more established before the really hot conditions of summer come. It's better for them to have a deep root system where they can access water continually rather than a shallow root system of a tiny seedling dealing with the heat of summer. Additionally, I also mentioned a lot of brassica plants that I like to start early, which include broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, kale, Brussels sprouts. All of those plants really do better when they're started early. Additionally, onions. I did mention those in the direct sown section. Onions have a really long growing season that they require, so it's really best to start those early as well. So now that we have an idea of what does best direct sown versus started early, let's plan our seed starting schedule. So to plan out your seed starting schedule, first you're going to want to go back and look at that last frost date that you found. You're going to want to keep that in mind. Go ahead and locate that date on the calendar. Now while you're finding that, we are going to get out some different seed packets that we're going to look at here. Let's start with peppers. So I have here a packet for jalapeno peppers. As I mentioned, peppers are a plant that you do want to make sure to direct sow. So let's take a look at the seed packet here. they recommend starting indoors 8 to 10 weeks before the last frost. So now that you have your last frost date on the calendar, you're going to want to count back about 8 to 10 weeks, and you're going to mark on your calendar, you want to start your pepper seeds on that day. Now, a lot of times what I'll do is, it says 8 to 10 weeks. A lot of times I'll go right in the middle and say 9 weeks. Sometimes there may be a reason that you want to start your plants a little bit early or a little bit late. Maybe you're going to be out of town and not able to plant them. Maybe you're hoping to plant them early with some season extension. Whatever the case may be, you want to count back, use your seed packet as a guide, because your seed packet should tell you when your plants should get started. Now let's pull out some tomatoes and take a look at those. I have here some Roma tomatoes. You can see on the seed packet here, these they recommend to start 6 to 8 weeks before your last frost date. So again, so maybe about 2 weeks after you start your peppers, you're going to want to start your tomatoes. So you just want to go through your different seed packets like that and look at when they recommend, or when the company recommends, starting those seeds. And just make a note on your calendar when you plan to start them. That should give you a really great plan that you can stick to get your seeds started on time. So it is pretty important to make sure that you start your seeds at the right time. You don't want to start them too early or too late. What can happen if you start your seeds too early? The plants can get really large. They can get unmanageable. You may end up having to transplant them into really large pots, and if you don't have the space for that, that can be pretty overwhelming. The other thing that can happen is your plants can grow really tall and really weak stems. They can get what's called leggy, they can get spindly, and then when you transplant them outside, they're not really prepared for life outside. So while a tomato seedling that's about 6 weeks old or so, if you've grown it well, if you've given it a good light source and the right amount of nutrients, it will be strong and sturdy. A tomato seedling that's maybe 12 weeks old might be really large, it might be leggy, very difficult to transplant, and just not as likely to be successful as one that was started at the right time. Now, if you start your plant too late, I mean, it's pretty obvious what can happen. Your seedling could be small. You're going to potentially be robbing yourself of some harvest time. So really that 6 to 8 week window for a tomato seedling is really what you're shooting for, so try your best to get it started in that window there. Now, as you garden and you play around with seed starting, you're going to fine-tune this a lot more with experience. It can seem overwhelming, but the more you do it, the easier it becomes, and it really becomes almost second nature. I have found through experience that there are some things that I don't follow exactly. For example, many places say, if you're looking at, say, a broccoli seedling, they say to start it about 4 to 6 weeks before your last frost date, and then to transplant that plant out on your last frost date. I have found in my area that's really not the greatest advice. It's possible the source that I read that information from was maybe a very different growing climate than mine, and in their area that may have been the correct advice. In my area, what I really find is that broccoli does best when I transplant it out about 4 weeks before my last frost date, and it does best when I start my seeds inside 4 to 6 weeks before that 4 week. So in that case, I have to count back about 8 to 10 weeks before my last frost date to figure out when to start my broccoli. So that's the kind of thing that will come with experience. It will come with talking to local gardeners in your area who've been successful and see what they do. But honestly, the best way to learn with gardening is just to do it. The worst thing that can happen is you'll have a plant that's not successful, and you'll know what to do better for next year. And if it doesn't do well, you can always buy a transplant as a backup. So as gardening season gets closer, we are definitely going to start some seeds together, but I know there's a lot of you that are pretty far south of me, and the time to start seeds might be now or it might be really soon. So I'm going to go ahead and link a video that I did last year all about Seed Starting 101. So that way if your growing season is ahead of mine and you want to get started and not wait for me to start my seeds, you can go ahead and check that out now. I'm going to continue on with this video, and I think probably the next video that I post in this series will be talking about the difference between cool weather and warm weather plants. So I definitely hope you will join me for that. I hope that you're having a great day, and I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.